Our next speaker also is quite excellent. Another old friend, Olivia Enos, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, an expert on East Asia, on democracy, on religious freedom, and perhaps most importantly, a graduate of Patrick Henry College, a few of whose students are in the room, I believe. So please give her a round of applause.
I think I'm a little shorter than the last speaker. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Olivia Enos, and I'm really delighted to be here. It's fitting that Mark started off with an introduction about me having gone to Patrick Henry, because the start of my talk is actually on my time at Patrick Henry. When I was a junior in college at Patrick Henry, I took a course on the negative impacts of communism worldwide. It was an elective, and within that class, we were assigned a tome of a book. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's called The Black Book of Communism. That book details the tactics that communist regimes use all throughout the world, and doesn't just stop there. It also talked about the outcomes of communism. And I remember being shocked because Asia in particular stood out. This book covered the entire globe and the entire history of communism, but Asia stood out because there were so many regimes where communism was still alive and well. And in particular, North Korea stood out to me because I was so shocked that it took me all the way to my junior year in college to realize that there were individuals inside political prison camps today. The numbers that we have, the figures that we have to suggest the number of people that are there are likely outdated. They're from 10 years ago, and hopefully they'll get updated actually through a UN report that's forthcoming next September. But they estimate that there are between 80,000 to 120,000 individuals held hostage by the Kim regime in these political prison camps. I remember from growing up when I learned about the history of the Holocaust and I heard about the plight of the Jewish people. And I remember reading Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl. And as I was reading about North Korea, I couldn't help but wonder, who are the Anne Franks that we have yet to hear from? And perhaps there are some that we have, but their stories are not especially popular. They're not in the media every single day. We don't hear about their plight. They're often a forgotten people. But I don't want us here today to forget those people, because even as aspiring policymakers, we have to remember that people are the reason why it is so important that we get policy and policy decision-making right. The story of North Korean Christian Hyuna stands out very vividly in my mind. She's a North Korean Christian woman who attempted to flee North Korea on 4 separate occasions. It took 4 times for her to successfully leave. On one of her attempts to escape, she was found pregnant by a Chinese man who she had been forcibly married off to. Upon discovery that she was both a Christian and that she was pregnant with a Chinese man's child, she was beaten and tortured, taken down to a police station, and forcibly subjected to an abortion without any anesthesia and without any medication. The loss of that child stands out in her mind very, very vividly. And even though the Lord has redeemed Hyunaji's story, she now lives in freedom in South Korea. She has a child of her own. The memory of the child that was taken from her by the Kim regime is not easily forgotten. And the Lord has redeemed her story because Ms. Hyunaji bravely speaks out on behalf of the North Korean people, knowing that there are many people who are not so-called as lucky as she to have made it beyond the borders. North Korea is one matter, but I'm even further dismayed that although I thought what had happened to North Korean people being put in political prison camps and whatnot were relegated to the history books, since I started my career over a decade ago, yet another people group is being subjugated in a similar and arguably more expeditious manner. And that's the Uyghur people in China. Today, the CCP holds an estimated 1.8 million individuals inside political re-education camps. Their detentions have occurred so quickly, so rapidly, And when we hear about their individual stories, I think it brings all of it to light. I'm reminded in particular of the story of Tursunizia Wooden, a brave Uyghur woman who survived rape and sexual violence in the camps. She bravely spoke to the BBC a few years back, and she provided the first of its kind first-hand account of the forms of rape and sexual violence that Uyghur women experience in the camps. In her own words to the BBC, she said that after experiencing rape, you can't tell anyone what happened. You can only lie down quietly. It is designed to destroy everyone's spirit. I think that last sentence there really typifies what motivates a lot of communist regimes, a desire to tamp down on the human individual spirit, because there's a real fear within communist regimes of the people themselves. So today, I want to take a look at, what China and North Korea have in common and think about what implications that has for U.S. policy when it comes to tackling the threats, which are very multifaceted, that the U.S. faces from North Korea and China, and frankly speaking, a lot of other communist regimes. The main thing I want to focus on today is that both the Chinese Communist Party and the Kim regime use human rights abuses in order to maintain their grip on power. It's an essential element of their ability to maintain that grip on power. If this is the case, and we truly believe that power politics are the rules of the road and govern foreign policy, then why is it that U.S. foreign policy does not do more to ameliorate and to address human rights concerns in its overarching strategy towards the Indo-Pacific? I hope that we can go a long way towards answering that question throughout my comments today. So first, I want to do a deep dive on China and North Korea. I want to tease out this idea that these two regimes use human rights violations in order to maintain power. And then I want to look at some of the ways that a next administration that cares about human rights could really put human rights into an overarching strategy to address these challenges. So first, we'll take a look at China. Before we look at the CCP's human rights violations, I think it's first important that we understand what motivates Chinese foreign policy. When I was at Georgetown, I took a class on that subject exactly, and we were assigned a book that I would commend to everyone in this room. It's called China's Search for Security. It's by Andrew Nathan and Andrew Scobell, and it essentially outlines what the core interests are of the party. And they argue that it's twofold. One, the CCP desires to ensure domestic stability, and second, it seeks to safeguard sovereignty. I would add a third onto this, that both of those domestic motivations, because they are principally insular and domestic, have to do with the CCP's paramount interest in maintaining the party's preeminence and ensuring that any threats to the party's continued reign are ameliorated. This means that issues that the U.S. government typically would put in a human rights bucket, these are issues like the ongoing genocide facing Uyghurs or the situation in Tibet, what's happening in Taiwan even at different points in time, and of course what's happening in Hong Kong. Often these issues are viewed as tangential and put in a separate bucket from the broader security challenges or the economic interests that we're facing, but these are far from tangential for the CCP. In fact, all of the areas where the CCP engages in persecution are directly because they believe that the people in these different groups threaten the party's core interests. In order to illustrate this, I want to do a deep dive on two specific situations in China. First, the situation facing Uyghurs, and second, we'll move to Hong Kong. So for Uyghurs, on the last day of the Trump administration, they determined that Uyghurs faced ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity. This was an incredibly important determination to rightfully recognize the severity of conditions Uyghurs face, and it has now been affirmed by the Biden administration. I want to be clear that genocide is not a word to just be bandied around. It has a very specific definition in international law. And the hardest element of genocide to prove is intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a people group on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, etc. And there can be no doubt in my mind that that is what Uyghurs face. As I mentioned at the outset, there's at least 1.8 million Uyghurs that are inside political re-education camps today. Some have suggested that figure could be as high as 3 million. I guess we will know perhaps in the future, but regardless, it's a massive scale. Uyghurs are not just subject to indoctrination and torture and rape and sexual violence in the camps. They're also subject to various forms of forced labor, both inside the camps and outside of the camps. Those who are subject to forced labor are estimated to be around 3 million by a really fabulous scholar, Adrian Zenz. I would commend his work to everyone. He works at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And it is the largest state-sponsored forced labor program in the world. 3 million people. Many of those individuals are sent outside of the Uyghur region or outside of Xinjiang, as we're familiar with it. And this is an effort to further collectivize and also separate and uproot Uyghurs from their homeland area. The basis for the atrocity determination, although, of course, the fact that they're in the camps, the fact that they're subject to forced labor is significant, has to do with forced abortions and forced sterilizations. Similarly, Adrian Zenz did incredible work and found firsthand CCP documentation saying that that the CCP has a desire to forcibly sterilize Uyghur women of childbearing age to the tune of 80 to 90% of Uyghur women. That means that they are seeking to eliminate not just the current generation of Uyghurs, but future generations of Uyghurs as well. I see this as a part of the CCP's attack on the Uyghur family unit. This is a common thread that comes up within communist regimes. I think if communism gets one thing right, it's that they do recognize the importance of the family unit, and in an effort to destroy that, they seek to undermine the family unit at every conceivable level. Many children are sent away from their parents to so-called live-in kindergartens, in part because parents might be in the camps, in part because they may be sent away to labor, but principally because the CCP desires to re-educate them so that they can become good little communists that can adhere to what the CCP believes is right. I remember actually when I was on maternity leave with my firstborn son, he's 18 months old, I saw a video of Uyghur little boys. I think they were ages 5 to 9. This was from a source called Bitter Winter. And the little boys were asked by CCP officials, what do you want to be when you grow up? And every little boy said, I want to be a good member of the Chinese Communist Party, and I want to join the People's Liberation Army or the People's Liberation Navy. And I was so struck by this because I realized that even at the most fundamental human level, the CCP was seeking to replace the dreams of little kids with the goals and the aims of the party. It was just so shocking to me. All of this is incredibly, incredibly intentional. I don't think anyone should doubt why the CCP does this. And I think a common theme within communist countries and communist governments is that where there are units of trust, the party will seek to undermine them, whether that's friendships or neighbor to neighbor, student to teacher, family and parent to child. You just see an effort to replace those things that make human life truly worth living with the government instead. So the CCP specifically targets Uyghurs, and I would say that it's falsely because they believe that Uyghurs threaten their core interests, which we talked about at the beginning. They believe that Uyghurs are a threat to sovereignty. They label them falsely as terrorists simply on the basis that they're Muslim, and they use that as a justification to be able to target them at these mass scales. The next issue that I want to cover, and I promise I'll cover this a little bit more briefly, but the Uyghur issue just is so hard. I think we all have to think about it really deeply, is we all bore witness to what happened in Hong Kong in 2020. In Hong Kong, the CCP saw what they thought was a threat to their core interests, and they clamped down. Millions of Hong Kongers peacefully took to the streets in 2020 because the Hong Kong legislature had introduced legislation that would make it possible to extradite someone in Hong Kong back to the PRC to be tried for so-called political crimes and the like. And they saw this as a huge threat to their liberty, so they took to the streets. After the protests, the CCP implemented what's now known as the National Security Law, which fundamentally changed Hong Kong. Once the freest economy in the world, Hong Kong today is barely recognizable, especially when it comes to civil and political liberties and the rule of law. In its wake, Hong Kongers have seen at least 1,900 individuals who have been taken hostage as political prisoners. Many of them were even household names like Jimmy Lai, Joshua Wong, or Gwyneth Ho, who were all seen as very bright lights for liberty, standing for principles that many of us would say should absolutely be defended. We also saw the closure of Apple Daily and of Stand News. This was the onslaught of the CCP, the long arm, reaching into Hong Kong and reclaiming control in very vivid ways. But I think it's not just Hong Kongers who experienced the impacts of the CCP. I think it can be easy to think this is an insular issue, and of course the CCP would love for us to think that. In its wake, we have seen bounties issued by the Hong Kong government against even friends of mine, like Francis Hui, Anna Kwok, Joey Su, all individuals who are outspoken during the pro-democracy movement who have found refuge here in the US or in the UK or in Australia. And they now have bounties on their head. They're wanted by the Hong Kong government. It's truly, truly shocking. We've even seen in the UK the beating of a Hong Kong pro-democracy protester, Bob Chan, on British soil at the Chinese Manchester consulate. It was absolutely shocking to see that happen. And beyond that, we've seen severe degradations in the rule of law that have resulted in Hong Kong going from this free and open economic center to an increasingly risky place to do business, where they are now evading sanctions, involved in money laundering, setting up shell companies, and undermining the free and open business environment, not just in Hong Kong, but for the globe. There's a really amazing report by a friend of mine named Sam Bickett that he wrote for the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation that details this substantially. Hong Kong is essentially unrecognizable because the CCP viewed the Hong Kong people as a threat to its core interests. And I think Hong Kong is a good one for us to bear in mind because it has so many implications for us in general. Okay, so let's transition to North Korea. I don't want to only cover China because I want to demonstrate that many different regimes experience challenges and rely on human rights in order to maintain their power. I read a fabulous book called Becoming Kim Jong-un by Jung Pak. She was the former assistant secretary under the Biden administration for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. And she claimed in the book that nuclear weapons and human rights violations are two sides of the same coin for the Kim regime. The reason why she said this is multifaceted, and I'll just go into a few here. The North Korean people, at minimum, face crimes against humanity, according to the United Nations 2014 Commission of Inquiry report. As I mentioned at the outset, 80,000 to 120,000 individuals are held inside political prison camps. 3 generations of a family can be sent to a political prison camp for the so-called political crimes or sins of one. If you are in a society where your dad does something wrong and 3 generations of your family can be sent to a political prison camp, it discourages dissent at just incredible levels. The Kim regime backs that up with policies of mass purges that affect not just the ordinary people, but also the elites. And then it further backs that up by carrying out public executions at a level that is just astronomical. I remember reading one study where even an entire class of middle schoolers were taken to see a public execution as part of their school day, like a field trip. Could you imagine that? But the regime instills fear at a very, very early age. And reasons why you can be sent to a political prison camp or persecuted include things like failing to dust the mandatory portrait of the Kim regime on your household walls, watching a South Korean drama, or mere possession of a Bible. This is an invasion of privacy on such serious and heightened levels, and so it's something we have to be concerned about. Forced labor is also a feature of the Kim regime. They not only engage in forced labor through political prison camps similar to the CCP, but also by exporting individuals abroad. And it's estimated that at least $500 million in profits are generated annually for the Kim regime to fill their private coffers from the forced labor that they perpetrate. There's even been allegations that there's a direct connection between the funds that are generated by the Kim regime through forced labor and the ability of the Kim regime to continue their weapons development and programs. And there's an even more personal linkage between the development of their weapons programs and their human rights violations. Innocent North Korean populations, such as Kochebi children who are orphan children, or the elderly, or disabled individuals, have allegedly had chemical and biological weapons tested on them. My own research suggests that it's not just crimes against humanity that North Koreans face. It may also be ongoing genocide, particularly for North Korean Christians. And I have a Hudson report on that for anybody who is interested in reading more about it. It's clear to me that the regime would be unable to sustain itself without eliminating opposition in the myriad ways that I just outlined, and that even their nuclear weapons program is in many ways fortified by the ongoing abuses that we see taking place. When the U.S. foreign policy community decides to ignore the clear linkages between these regimes' maintenance of power and their perpetration of human rights violations, it leaves arguably very valuable diplomatic leverage on the diplomatic table. And as we are on the precipice of a new administration, I would urge future administrations and also individuals like you all who are aspiring policymakers to consider these linkages as we craft future U.S. policy toward China, North Korea, and also other similar regimes that you're no doubt learning about today. To that end, I would love to look at 4 specific buckets of areas where the U.S. government could shore up policies or take greater action in a way that would help the people of North Korea and the people of China, whose government is certainly not going to come to their aid and help them themselves. Number 1, sanctions and financial tools of engagement. There are new tools in the U.S. government toolbox, particularly through legislation and later an executive order that created the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Authorities. It enables individuals and entities to be targeted not just on national security grounds, but on human rights grounds for perpetrating these types of violations. I think it's very important, not just from a symbolic name and shame perspective, but to actually deny access to resources for those who are continuing to perpetuate these horrible abuses and violations of rights. Second, I would urge policymakers within the sanctions regime to think about some of the tools that are reached for less frequently, but have the ability to shift risk at much higher levels. This is especially relevant in Hong Kong, where their decision to engage in sanctions evasion, which includes sanctions implemented on human rights grounds, are continuing to enable Hong Kong to operate as a free and open business center. But the U.S. has the ability to designate Hong Kong or certain elements within Hong Kong as a primary money laundering concern. And this has the potential to make it so that the business community will think twice about engaging in Hong Kong when the Hong Kong government has become virtually unrecognizable from the CCP. The third under the sanctions and financial tools of engagement is the forced labor tools that we have at our disposal. I was so encouraged to see Congress pass the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was incredibly important legislation to tackle Uyghur forced labor, but I would love to see those tools strengthened further so that perpetrators of forced labor are directly punished, in addition to making sure that those goods don't find a home here in U.S. markets. The second bucket of policy recommendations I have is an atrocity determination. Although Uyghurs had an atrocity determination, we discussed it a little bit, the strength of the atrocity determination issued by the Trump administration. It actually led to the passage, arguably, of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act by Congress mere months after that atrocity determination happened. But there is no such atrocity determination for North Korea. And I think there's a great case for it. The UN has already established that crimes against humanity are happening, and I believe that there's also genocide happening. And when we clearly label something that is improper and wrong, it's amazing how quickly action follows. Sometimes just speaking truth actually results in a lot of follow-on action. And that's what I've been amazed by in all the previous instances of atrocity determinations being passed. The third is we have to think about ways to support people who are incredibly brave and sticking their neck out who remain within these countries, especially those who are political prisoners. I was shocked to learn, I'm actually in the process of writing a report on U.S. political prisoner advocacy, that there is no central hub within the executive branch for securing the release of political prisoners, even though we know that China is taking political prisoners at such a shockingly high rate. I think that should definitely change. And when I think about what better ways there are to support opposition to the regime than to extend support to human rights defenders and to political prisoners who are trying to seek and facilitate change from within, I truly can think of no other way to provide better support and to shift power away from the regime and towards the people. Fourth and finally, and I would say this is probably my favorite one, is to extend refugee and asylum relief. I think this flows very naturally from our faith as Christians to extend safe haven to those communities that face hardship. And there are a lot of different ways that we can actually provide priority relief to communities that are facing ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity, for those who are the most persecuted, so to speak. And to be able to offer them homes here so that people can advocate for change within their country from without their country when it's no longer safe for them to stay there. I will end on this note. I have a dear friend. She's actually coming into town this weekend. It's my baby shower for my second child is this weekend. And my dear friend Ziba is a Uyghur American, and her mom has been held inside the political re-education camps for, gosh, I think it's going on 7 years now that she has not seen her. She had her daughter just before her mom was taken into the political re-education camps there. And Ziba is a beneficiary of the refugee and asylum program here in the U.S. She bravely speaks out in every context that she possibly can in order to advocate and defend and try to secure the release of her mother. And I have benefited so immensely from her friendship. I know that when we think about policy, we so often think about, okay, how do we get things done? How do we have deliverables? And we forget about the intangible things like the results of the policy that end up creating I almost feel selfish saying it, but incredible friendships like the one I have with Ziba. And so many other Uyghurs who are so bravely advocating for their cause. So I think, to end, as believers, we're motivated by what Christ calls us to do in our lives, to honor him and to give him glory in and through all of our actions. And I think keeping people as a central motivation, that's why I started and ended with stories, is so essential to that, because the Lord has imbued each of us with human dignity at a level that is worthy of defense. And so it's worthy of not just defense, but our best defense. And so for those of you who are aspiring to work in foreign policy, I would urge you absolutely go into and work on security issues, absolutely go into it and work on economic issues, but also remember that there's a lot of important and critical work to be done on the human rights front too. And even if human rights is not your main area of focus, think critically and strategically about how it can be incorporated, because I think as believers, the defense of human rights and values flows very naturally from our motivations to seek the glory of the Lord. So thank you so much for having me here today, and I'm happy to answer questions. I think we still have time. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Daisy. I'm from Asbury Theological Seminary and originally from China. Thank you for sharing about the Uyghur group. And I think this is the successful brainwashing of Communist Party. They do this to millions of Uyghur people, but for people within China, and they will tell people like this, they are all terrorists. And we do this for your safety. And we do this for the unity, for the big family of the motherland, for the smaller families of you all. That's all for your good. And also about the sanction part, so the economy of China suffers a lot. And of course, the people's lives suffer too. And this is what the government tells its people. They say, okay, it is all the fault of Americans. You guys just hate Americans.
Yeah, this is a really common refrain that I hear on sanctions actually generally. And I think that I just wanted to clarify too that, there are sanctions policies that used to exist more along the lines of trade embargoes and whatnot that I think did have a more direct impact on ordinary people's lives. But the type of sanctions that the U.S. government reaches for now are called smart sanctions. They're more targeted in nature. And so they're designed to actually affect the bank account directly of the individual who has perpetrated the human rights violations, the security threat, the economic challenges. And I personally, working on human rights issues, I prefer that. I think it's far more just to hold directly accountable the individual or the entity that's perpetuating the human rights violations than to work more broadly. But I think it's really fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your own experience and the ways that the party would manipulate U.S. government actions in a way that would detract from the fact that the party is responsible for the suffering of the Chinese people, not the U.S. government. So it's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I also want to question about sanctions. I'm also researching the human rights issues in China and North Korea, especially myself. I'm South Korean, but I'm working with the North Korean ministry. I also talk to the missionaries and actual defectors. And I am very familiar with what you introduced today, the story of the human rights abuse in North Korea. But especially in North Korea, the person from China, I also actually agree with what she's saying, but sanctions effect is kind of different between China and North Korea. But sanctions are actually making the hostility against the U.S. among the North Korean, domestic North Korean situations, and North Korea more rely on the nuclearizations further. And of course, I don't recommend the cutting off the sanction at all, but I see that U.S. sanctions also created the mutual support between Russia and North Korea. So sanctions also lack the trade to the North Korea, because also North Korea has a trade from China on, their, ally countries. Sanctions also lack the trade to the North Korean people, and they are more they more lack the getting the foods because of its influence from the sanctions. That's why I don't see the sanctions are effectively respond to the human rights of the North Korean people. So how do you see this result of the sanction policy, which the U.S. took over 30 years? Also from my insight, for making better situation between, for North Korea and China, it's really up to the U.S. what kind of policy policy U.S. takes for East Asia. Honestly, I don't recommend the U.S. take the approach of the same human rights policy for North Korea and China, because they're very different structures. Of course, they share the communism, but they have different type of communism, especially China is a Maoism, and North Korea is Xi ideology, and their present position are completely different. So I would like to hear your opinions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we probably disagree on the impacts of sanctions. My own work when I was at Georgetown for my master's program looked at the kind of unintended consequences of sanctions. I think one of the really common arguments against sanctions is like, we've had sanctions against the Kim regime, they still have weapons programs, et cetera. But one of the really interesting things that I found from my own research was that number one, when the US and the UN implemented multilateral sanctions, and to be clear, these were principally security sanctions, it coincided with, and perhaps correlated, I won't claim causation, growth in the informal economy in North Korea. And the informal economy is an incredible lifeline for North Korean people to be able to gain access to information and also access to outside goods in order to provide for their own livelihood. The Kim regime, from cradle to grave, seeks to provide for the North Korean people and to restrict them. They give them jobs, et cetera, and they make it so that whatever they have or don't have is predicated principally on the regime. And when the US has at various times had lower levels of sanctions towards North Korea, I remember hearing reports from aid workers where they would go and try to deliver food aid, try to deliver food resources directly into the hands of the suffering North Korean people. And at night, the regime would go by and they would collect one by one the rice rations that had been given by the US government directly to the North Korean people. So any claims that the Kim regime makes that sanctions are the reason why the North Korean people are suffering, in my mind, are entirely false, because the regime consistently redistributes wealth away from the people and towards the regime in order to fortify their nuclear and missile programs and to continue to maintain their grip on power. I know there's different views on sanctions. I appreciate those. I don't think that sanctions are a fail-safe or even like a principle baseline for a policy. And I also agree with you that there are different policies we should pursue towards North Korea as opposed to China. But I don't think that we agree on that sanctions are the reason why North Korea is supporting Russia or is good friends with China. I think they are good friends because they share common interests in threatening core interests of the US and of the free world. And I don't think sanctions are the reason for that. But I do appreciate your thoughts and insights on that. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Mariah Barnell. I'm from Wyoming Catholic College. The history and rise of communism in China is very interesting, specifically in how, compared to other communist regimes, how Mao was able to twist it into telling everyone that China equals communism, communism equals China, and there is no difference. And looking at the few countries that we have successfully seen the fall of communism in. One of the main attributes to getting a successful fall of communism is the freedom of, well, maybe not the freedom, but the ability of the people to communicate with each other, to maybe print documents and spread leaflets around, and then people still get mad, but they're still able to communicate with each other. Yeah. With China today, because of technology, they're able to surveillance the people to a greater degree than has been possible in the past with other communist nations. And so I guess my question is, how can the US, how can the companies with the social media companies, which are mainly based in the US, how can they actually start to assist in decoupling this idea of China equals communism, communism equals China, by undoing like some of the communist firewalls that they have up, because China doesn't have really access to the free world
Yeah.
on the internet. How can the U.S. by legislation or by executive order force these social media companies to give the Chinese people more education?
That's a great question and a great point. I think access to information is absolutely essential, and we've seen this both come up in the case of North Korea as well as in the case of China. There is really incredible work being done by Radio Free Asia in particular, and some of the elements of the U.S. government that are responsible for improving information access in very closed countries. I think making better use of those tools and ensuring that they stay funded is very important, especially that individuals have access to VPNs to be able to access outside information, but also to make sure that ordinary people who are brave, because it takes a lot to be able to be reading outside information that's contradictory to any communist regime. It's very brave. You don't think about when you sit down to read that it might be an act of bravery, but for many Chinese and North Korean people, it is. I think there's a role also, and we didn't cover this because I was focused so much on government elements, but there are a lot of roles for civil society too in order to get information into closed societies. And those small networks that are built amongst churches, that are built amongst NGOs, and built amongst civil society are essential in order to help improve access to information. I think this is an area that needs greater work, especially because I think the U.S. government is a little bit antiquated in the different ways that we do promote information access. I mean, some of the slower means of promoting information access are very important, but we should be thinking about how some of the bigger tech companies could maybe provide ways to disrupt and break down the firewall in meaningful ways for those who would seek outside information. So thank you for your point on that. Appreciate it. Are we out of time now? Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate it.